Good evening, everyone. How you doing? Thank you for joining us tonight. It's a terrible night for astronomy because it's 100% humidity up here at Chabot, and so you've found the alternative, which is to listen to tonight's presentation by our speaker, George Leopold. But before I introduce George and before we get to tonight's topic, I do have a number of announcements to make. First of all, a number of you may have noticed in your email that there's going to be a special Zoom meeting tomorrow night hosted by Sujay Nair. If you remember from a few months ago, Sujay decided to get a group together from the East Bay Astronomical Society to do some exoplanet data reduction for calibrating the point at which exoplanets dim their orbiting star to the maximum amount. And when that data is calibrated, it helps researchers schedule their telescope time. And Sujay is planning on taking the data that our participants have reduced and turn it into a poster for an upcoming conference. And he's going to give an update on that work, and it should be interesting. That's at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. We sent the Zoom link out on the Night Sky Network, and I will put it in the chat window for on this meeting as well. So after George gets started tonight, I'll paste that into the window, and I hope some of you can join us tomorrow night. Normally, Dave Rodriguez would be jumping in and he would be introducing our speaker, but Dave is on the road and he got a kick out of telling me this morning that he's in the town of Fredonia in Colorado. And then, of course, he typed out the whole song of Hail, Hail, Fredonia, Land of the Brave and Free from the Marx Brothers movie. And so he's having a great time in Colorado in the Grand Canyon. And he went to the Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell and just basically having a good time getting out of town. So he can't join us tonight. But he did want to share that next month we will be having Dr. Dan Wertheimer of the UC Astronomy Department. He's talking about is anyone out there using new techniques in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? And Dan, if you remember, is the founder of the SETI at Home project. And some of you may have participated in that many years ago when our computers were busy doing nothing but looking for extraterrestrial life while we were downstairs cooking dinner or watching TV. But anyhow, Dan will be joining us to give a talk on the latest from SETI. And that's pretty much it for announcements. Of course, stay in touch with the Chabot website to find out what live events on Zoom and Facebook they'll be having. We do have our live from Chabot event every Saturday night. Gerald and I do live presentations from Nellie. Obviously tonight we're not going to be doing any telescope viewing, but we have some other topics that we'll be able to talk about and show lots of pictures. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is George Leopold, and George is a veteran journalist and science writer who writes about the nexus between technology and public policy. George, maybe you should unmute yourself and show your video, and that way people could see you while I introduce you. Hey, there you are. So George has written extensively about U.S. manned spaceflight, including the Apollo and Space Shuttle programs, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Scientist, and a variety of other technology publications, including the EE Times, the Electrical Engineering Times. And you live in Reston, Virginia, still?
That is correct. Yes, just
outside. Oh yeah, so it's much later for you. So
that's okay. Thank you. Be up on Saturday night anyway.
Yeah, well, thank you for staying up late for us. It's one of the silver linings of this whole situation is that we get have speakers from farther afield. And we really appreciate you agreeing to talk to us tonight.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'll stay online here until you're successfully shared your PowerPoint and all that, just in case.
Okay. So you want me to hit share screen, right, Richard?
Yeah, go ahead and do the share, and let's make sure we can see your slides.
Okay. What happened? I'm seeing host disabled attendee screen.
Hold on for a moment. Let me get that fixed for you.
Okay. Just wait for mission control to give me
a
thumbs up.
That's right. You can't do anything without Houston agreeing.
That's it.
Yeah.
So
okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. There we go. And I'm hitting desktop, I think, right?
I think you're if you've started your slideshow, it'll be the one with the slide. Alternatively, you could do desktop and start it.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
I see you're writing the stars to the moon slide. Is that the right one?
That's the one.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. The reference to Fredonia and the Marx Brothers reminds me of the Groucho Marx line, "I thought my razor was dull until I heard that speech." So I'll try to do better. So I thought before we talk about my subject, Gus Grissom, I thought it'd be appropriate to talk a little bit about what you folks are interested in, and that's the celestial navigation that was used to get to the moon. What you're seeing here is the very first piece of hardware that was developed for Project Apollo in the early 60s. This is basically the business end of the Apollo guidance computer. It's called the DISCI, the keyboard display. And you might notice it mentions verbs and nouns, and it had a capacity of a couple thousand words. And basically, what it meant was the noun would be, for example, engine, and the verb would be fire. So they'd punch that in and hit it. So this was critical. This was the number one first contract. MIT got it, and the setup was that this device controlled a 3 gimbal inertial platform, and it was the command module pilot, one of the 3 members of the Apollo crew, would select stars and use those stars would be he would use a telescope or a sextant to spot a couple dozen stars that have been designated for each flight. So, you know, they're basically using the same sort of instruments as the ancient mariners. This was done during Gemini and Apollo to observe and record designated constellations, individual stars. In one case, and we'll get into it, was with Cassiopeia. So on Gemini 10, Mike Collins, who would later be on the first Apollo moon landing crew, acquired the name Magellan because he actually worked out a lot of the celestial navigation on the program that preceded Apollo, which was Project Gemini, which was the in-between stage between Project Mercury, Project Apollo. And he did 2 spacewalks, but on the first one, they opened the hatch, he stood up in the hatch, and he recorded the signatures of different stars, so that they were basically developing a database that they could use later on. So during the stand-up EVA, he's using a special camera. He's recording the ultraviolet signatures of these constellations, and they're gathering this information. And this is how we end up getting to the moon. So Mike Collins was supposed to be on the first trip to the moon, not a landing, but the Apollo 8 mission, which orbited the moon in December of 1968. He was replaced by Jim Lovell, who you see here. They're on their way to the moon, and he is in the process of identifying a star. Once he's got it in the crosshairs, he'll punch that data into the guidance computer, and what he's going to do is use that star angle along with the horizon of the Earth to determine where they are in space and how they're going to get to the moon at a point in the universe 3 days from now. So this is the actual instrument, the hardware that was used during Apollo to do these star sightings, and then to feed that data into the guidance computer to align the platform and to get them to where they wanted to be 3 days hence. It took about 3 days after launch, after leaving Earth orbit, to get to the moon. So in the process of aligning their platform, they'd record these star sightings, they punch the coordinates into the guidance computer, and then the ground would give them additional information like state vectors and other guidance data like the gimbal angles, and these things would be fed into the IMU, that is the inertial measurement unit. And these data would be used for minor course adjustments on the way to the moon, and if necessary for mid-course corrections. But on most of the lunar flights, the platform was stable. They had the proper attitude, so they didn't really have to do much in the way of mid-course corrections. So the system worked great. So this is basically the principle that's involved here. You're getting the star. You're using the horizon of the Earth for your second angle. You measure the angle, and that's where, so you know you're pointed in the right direction, and you're trying to get to the moon, as I say, 3 days hence. So the system worked great. They had about a list of 37 stars. Here's the Apollo 11 star chart. So what they would do is, depending on their orientation, Collins would pick out a star. He'd get it in the crosshairs, punch it into his guidance computer, and then they'd work out the calculations and figure, okay, we're pointed in the right direction. And you know, the precision on this was amazing. I mean, when they would predict we're going to lose the signal when you go around the backside of the moon at such and such a point, ground elapsed time, and they were usually within 3 or 4 seconds. It was pretty amazing. And Collins got so involved in all of this that when they got a dog, I think he named the dog Sirius. Sirius was one of the stars they used in Regulus and Vega and so forth. So I just thought that was for astronomers, I thought that was an interesting aspect of the Apollo program. We don't get to the moon without this capability. So my subject didn't really work much in this area. He was more involved in sort of systems integration, that type of thing. But on his first flight, his Mercury flight in July of 1961, he bet John Glenn that during his 5-minute flight, he would, well, he was actually, it was a 50-minute flight, but he bet Glenn a steak dinner that he would see a star. And he said he did see a star, and he said it was Polaris. The chances are it was probably not a star. It was probably Venus, but as I note here, Gus ordered his steak medium rare. So let's transition now to my favorite subject, which is Gus Grissom. You may know that a remake of The Right Stuff premiered last night on Disney Plus. It's getting sort of mixed reviews. It's gotten a lot of attention, and one critic this morning said noting the hype for the show, said it had a great launch, but it's got a dangerously low orbit. So we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that they do better in terms of how they present Gus. So the book, The Right Stuff, is a good book. The movie was pretty good, but it had one flaw, and that was its presentation of the flight of Gus Grissom. So therefore, I present the following talk. This is the cover of my book. It was published by Purdue in 2016. The paperback came out in 2018, and it's been quite an experience. It took me 7 years to write it, and what I wanted to do was to try to correct the record that was presented in the book and the film. Given this sort of the distortion of the historical record of manned spaceflight over the past 50 years, I wanted to correct the record and reestablish the bona fides of U.S. Air Force Colonel Virgil I. Gus Grissom as a combat veteran and all-weather test pilot, and to reestablish his credentials as an astronaut and ultimately as a space pioneer. Gus didn't see himself as a hero, but he did think of himself as a pioneer. He understood that the nation that could reach the moon first would reap considerable international prestige. And I would argue that the moon landings of the 1960s and early 1970s are one of the greatest technological achievements of the 20th century. And I'd also argue that without the contributions of Gus Grissom and his Apollo 1 crewmates, President Kennedy's goal of reaching the moon and returning men safely to the Earth by the end of the 1960s probably wouldn't have been achieved. So here's our hero. He would cringe if he heard me say that. So Gus Grissom graduates from high school in 1944. He wants to fly badly, but he gets into the Army Air Corps too late, and he ends up flying a desk until the end of World War II. So he goes back to Mitchell, Indiana, where he grew up, and he's putting doors on buses at a factory in his hometown, a town that the train came through. The B&O and the Monon railroads had a junction in Mitchell, Indiana, which was really the only reason there was a town there. But there was some industry. Gus comes back from the war. He gets a job, which wasn't easy to do after the war, but he's also eligible for the GI Bill of Rights. So he decides to enroll at Purdue University, my publisher, as an engineering student. And he gets through Purdue in 3.5 years, and it re-enlists in what is now the U.S. Air Force. And where you see him here at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas in 1950s. He's in flight training. He's trying to learn how to fly this gigantic trainer called a T6 Texan. They forgot to tell him about the trim wheel. I'm not a pilot. Maybe there's some pilots listening tonight, but if you can't trim your aircraft, it makes it really hard to fly. Gus asked for one more chance before he washed out of pilot training, and he was informed of the trim wheel, used it, and from that point on, he became one with the machine. So then he moved up to jet-powered aircraft, and what's happening here is he's establishing there's a pattern in his career, this fascination with machines, needing to master these machines and go faster and faster. So by the end of 1950, he gets shipped off to Korea, and he flies 100 combat missions over Korea as a wingman in the 334th Fighter Interceptor Squad. And during that period of time, he didn't shoot any MiGs down, but he was shot at a lot. He never lost a leader because he possessed the quality that was required of a wingman, and that was reliability. So he gets the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and then he tries to re-enlist for 25 more missions, but instead they ship him back home to be in flight, to be a flight instructor, which he concluded was more dangerous than aerial combat. So the war ends. He's sort of bouncing from one air base to the next. He eventually gets his master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and the way to move up in the Air Force is to go out to Edwards to the flight test school. And this is class 56D at Edwards Air Force Base, 1956. Gus is middle, front row, right in the middle. And on the end is another Mercury astronaut. The front row on your left is Gordon Cooper. So these two guys sort of moved in parallel between Wright Pat Air Force Base, Edwards, and then ultimately they both get selected as Mercury astronauts in 1959. So Gus is doing flight testing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. One day he gets a call saying he's report to the Pentagon and wear his civilian, don't wear his uniform, wear a civilian attire, and there's going to be a private briefing. And this is a couple of weeks after Sputnik is launched in 1957. What's happening is he's being recruited for this program called Project Mercury. And they interviewed about 2 groups of test pilots, and enough of them signed up that they didn't even do the 3rd batch. And then it was winnowed down. The book and the film, The Right Stuff, documents beautifully what the torture these guys went. And Gus makes it, along with John Glenn, Alan Shepard, Wally Schirra, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, as the Mercury 7. So they're working on a spacecraft, but in the meantime, they have to get a booster that will not blow up. And the quote you see there is from Jim Lovell. The rocket, Atlas rockets were blowing up left and right down at the Cape, and he said it looked like a quick way to have a short career. Folks I interviewed said that about 70% of the American rocket launches in the late 50s and early 60s failed. And if a booster exploded, but it didn't destroy the launch pad, they considered it a success. But this is what these guys signed up for, that they were willing to accept these risks. And they were astronaut engineers. Guys like Gus Grissom would work very hard to try to minimize these risks, to try to come up with every possible scenario, redundant designs, and so forth. So Gus is among the 3 sort of finalists to get the first flight on Mercury. And at this point, they could have been the first human being in space. But as you may remember, Yuri Gagarin flew 1 lap around the Earth in April of 1961. He was the first human to fly in space. And then Alan Shepard followed a few weeks later with a suborbital flight. And at that point, President Kennedy goes before Congress and says, we're going to land humans on the moon by the end of the decade and return them safely. So the space race is on. So we got about, and Kennedy did this with about exactly 50 minutes of experience in space flight. So this was pretty bold. This was pretty risky. So Shepard gets the first flight. Gus Grissom gets the second flight. So after about 2 years of training, here's Gus going over his checklist one last time for his flight on Liberty Bell 7 in July of 1961. So you get sort of a sense of how claustrophobic it must have been when they closed the hatch on this thing. Hundreds of thousands of components, and they've all got to work or you don't come back. So Gus is going to do pretty much a repeat of Shepard's suborbital flight. It's a ballistic trajectory, but there are some differences in Gus's spacecraft. He's got a new hand controller. They want to test you can't really, you couldn't maneuver this Mercury spacecraft, but you could control pitch, roll, and yaw. So he's got a new hand controller. He's got a larger window so he can make some navigation and other observations. And the biggest change is that this spacecraft has an exploding hatch. This is something that the astronauts lobbied for. It was like, you know, you could punch out of a jet fighter if your engine flamed out. So the hatch was, it had a mild detonating fuse on it, and it had 70 titanium bolts, and they would drill holes in those bolts. So when you hit a plunger, it would blow the hatch. So the plan was that at the end of Gus's flight, the helicopter would come in, pull him out of the water, get the hatch sill above the water line, then he would blow the hatch. So after a couple of delays, Liberty Bell goes 7 goes off on the morning of July 21st, 1961. And again, it's a 15-minute suborbital flight. The Redstone rocket you see here is a modified version of a V2. Werner von Braun was the guy who designed this rocket. So it didn't have enough oomph to it to get him to orbit, but you know, basically it was a flight to check out the systems. It was sort of typical of Gus, nothing fancy, but you know, they were going to make sure that these systems work, and the idea here was that they were preparing for the first orbital flight, which would come in February of '62, John Glenn's flight. So he basically flies a textbook 15-minute flight. He separates from the booster. The first thing he has to do is he has to turn the spacecraft around, blunt end forward, because he almost immediately after 5 minutes of weightlessness, he's got to prepare to come back down. So he has time to check out his hand controller. He finds it's lagging a little bit, so they know they've got to make adjustments to that. He makes a few observations out the window. He can't believe how bright the sun is, how black the sky is. One of the astronauts said one of the most surprising things about riding on a rocket was, you know, if you're a jet fighter pilot, you sort of level off at 45 or 40,000 feet. But if you're on a rocket, you know, you hit 90,000 feet and you're still going straight up. So quite a new sensation. So Gus completes these things, then he fires his retro rockets. He didn't really need them, but they wanted to test them, and that slows the spacecraft down. So you come back down on the other side of that ballistic trajectory, and he's coming down, and they want to see how much the G forces he's pulling on the way down affect him, and he's actually, you can tell by the voice transmissions, he's pulling about 6 or 7 Gs, so his voice is very strained, but you know, he keeps communicating. Then his drogue chute comes down, which is designed to slow the descent down, and then finally his main parachutes come out. And in the process, Gus notes that there's a triangular tear in one of his main parachutes. So this is disconcerting, but you know, he just sort of reports it matter of factly. Then just before you hit the water, you release it's a landing bag, which was designed to cushion the impact when you hit the water. So basically, it was a textbook flight. They accomplished everything that they wanted to do, and then the next step was to do the recovery, which was a part of the mission that they didn't really practice very much. It was sort of they got to it when they could, but they were more interested in, you know, what he was going to do while he was up in space weightless. But the sequence was that once he's in the water, he's got to deploy all of the recovery aids, a dye marker in the water, and he deploys a whip antenna that sticks out of the top of the capsule. And this is how he communicates with the recovery forces. And when they come in to pick him up, they've actually got to snip this antenna off. So Gus is in the water. He hears what he thinks is water gurgling. Maybe his ship is leaking. Maybe it's not that seaworthy, but he doesn't really worry about it. And he disconnects his restraints. He disconnects his oxygen hose. One thing that he forgets to do, and this becomes important later, is there's an oxygen inlet valve in his suit, and he forgets to close it. So he's in communications with the recovery people, and he tells them, give me a few minutes, because the procedure was he needed to mark all of his switch positions. So he does this with a grease pen, and he tells them, okay, I'm almost ready. If you guys want to come in, and they're going to come in, pick him up, as I say, and lift him out of the water. He's going to blow the hatch. So he's sitting there, and he says, he's thinking to himself, well, I'd like to be ready. So he pulls the cotter pin on the mechanism to blow the hatch. And so the hatch is armed, and he's sitting there contemplating whether or not he should take a very nice custom-made survival knife. And at that moment, as the helicopter's coming over to latch on, pow, the latch blows, or the hatch blows off, and water starts pouring into the spacecraft. And then Gus is in big trouble. Turns out that after everything he's been through, being in the water at the end of the flight was the most dangerous part of the flight. So in the aftermath, this is the recovery helicopter hovering over Liberty Bell 7, which is now taking on water. And this guy, his name is John Reinhardt, and he is trying to lower a horse collar down to Gus, and they've latched on to the spacecraft, and they're trying to drain the water out of it so they can pick it up, but it's taking on more and more water, and the helicopter is having serious problems trying to get the spacecraft out of the water. So this is, I believe, the moment. I apologize, this isn't a very good image, but I think this is the moment that the hatch blows. Now, this idea that John Reinhardt said that when he made contact with the spacecraft with a device to cut that whip antenna, he saw an arc. And that might have indicated some sort of an electrostatic discharge that may have had something to do with the hatch blowing. He said he saw an arc, and he was the person closest to the spacecraft when the hatch blew. I don't have any imagery of precisely where the helicopter was when the hatch blew, but this is one potential explanation for why the hatch blew, and it's completely different from what you will read in Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, and the movie. So we'll go through a series of images here of what happens after the hatch blows. Gus said all he remembered was tossing his helmet out of the spacecraft and somehow getting himself through that small opening, that small hatch, and into the water. Gus was 5 feet 7 inches tall. So he, being small, actually helped him get out, because if he'd stayed in the spacecraft, he certainly would have gone down with it in 16,000 feet of water. So let me go through a series of images of what happens immediately after. So there you see Gus getting out, and the helicopter appears to be directly over the spacecraft at the moment the hatch is blown. There you see the spacecraft is actually underwater. It almost looks like the helicopter landing gear is making contact with the spacecraft. That you can see Gus there trying to help them to latch onto the spacecraft, because he doesn't want to lose it. That's the worst thing that could happen, especially in front of millions of people. So there you see him giving a thumbs up signal, saying, "You've latched on, start pulling up." Now the guys in the helicopter think that Gus's suit is keeping him above water, and they don't have to worry about him. That the suit is, it's pumped up. He would have unfurled a neck dam that would have kept water from pouring in over his helmet ring. But as it turned out, the neck dam had been folded up for so long that it didn't provide a good seal. So Gus is in the water for about 5 minutes before he gets picked up, and he is in serious trouble. He's taken on water, and he's fighting to keep his nose above water. So this is sort of the iconic image of the flight of Liberty Bell 7, Gus Grissom, after 5 minutes in the water, hanging backwards from a horse collar like a dead fish. What happened was that the main recovery helicopter cut loose Liberty Bell 7. It sank in 16,000 feet of water. And Gus is fighting to keep his nose above water. Another helicopter moves in and just throws the horse collar down. He grabs it. He doesn't really care if he gets it on straight or not. But this is sort of the image that everybody remembers of the so-called hard luck astronaut. I have a different theory about all of that, which I discuss in a lot of detail in the book. So Gus makes it back to the Bermudas, and then he flies back to the Cape, and then the next day, rather than letting him rest after almost drowning, NASA insists that he come back to Cocoa Beach and do a press conference at the Holiday Inn, and this is in July in Cocoa Beach with no air conditioning and lots of hot lights. And Gus recounts what happens, basically what we've just talked about. And he mentions that he was scared when he was in the water. And a reporter says, "You were what?" And he's, "Okay, I said I was scared." So this remark, this moment of honesty as he's being hung out to dry by Jim Webb and Bob Gilruth behind him, it was misconstrued over the years as taken that Gus had panicked after he splashed down, and this is the myth that was propagated in the right stuff, and it simply did not happen. Gus was afraid he was going to drown. He wasn't afraid to fly in a spacecraft. He certainly wasn't afraid of strapping himself to a rocket and taking it into space. But basically the damage was done to his reputation. And 2 decades later, this film version of Tom Wolfe's book repeats this myth that Gus panicked at the end of an otherwise successful flight. And my point is, why would you panic? You've just flown a ballistic trajectory. You've been weightless for 5 minutes. You pull about 5 or 6 Gs on the way down. You observe a tear in your main parachute, and you're in the water. If anything, I would argue he would have been relieved. He wouldn't have panicked. So I think we can safely conclude that Gus didn't hit the chicken switch. So in 30 years after the moon landing, July 30th, 1999, a guy named Kurt Newport found and recovered Liberty Bell 7. This is a picture of the spacecraft at the Indianapolis Children's Museum a couple of years ago. It's been beautifully restored. You see in the back is the landing bag that would deploy at, just before splashdown. And another possible reason for the hatch prematurely going off, and one that Gus Grissom believed, was that there was an external lanyard on the spacecraft which would allow the the recovery team to blow the hatch from the outside if necessary. The inside hatch that Gus armed required about 5 pounds of pressure to activate, and it had a nasty kick. The outside lanyard required about 40 pounds of pressure. It's possible that the straps of this landing bag could have caught in that lanyard as it was sticking out, and that could have activated the hatch as well. But NASA tried to recreate as best they could the circumstances of why the hatch blew. But the one thing they couldn't recreate were the conditions in the water that day. The water temperature was about 80 degrees. You get this huge helicopter vortex creating all static electricity over the spacecraft that wasn't grounded before this guy John Reinhardt tried to snip the antenna. So really a definitive answer as to why the hatch blew prematurely. You can't say definitively one way or the other, except you can say that Gus Grissom didn't hit the chicken switch. So Gus basically sort of takes this big hit to his reputation, and he's for the rest of his life he's got to put up with what he referred to as the hatch crap. And he realizes he's not going to get another flight on Mercury. John Glenn gets the first orbital flight, and pretty soon they're going to wind it down because they want to move on to the next step in the American space program, which is the two-man Gemini program. So Gus transitions back to St. Louis and becomes deeply involved in the design of a new American spacecraft, and it would turn out to be the first true spacecraft that you could actually fly in space. That is, not just pitch, yaw, and roll. You could actually change your orbital plane in space, and this was one of the key steps to getting to the moon. So this is the interior of the Gemini spacecraft, two-man spacecraft. It was considered the Corvette of spacecraft. Every mission was successful, and Gus worked on a lot of the systems in Gemini or on Mercury. He had to rip out a lot of components if you needed to pull something out and repair it, and then everything had to be reinstalled and tested and validated. So on Gemini, they used this modular approach where you could just pull out different sections without disrupting the entire systems. So this program is really underappreciated. It proved, first of all, Gus Grissom on his first flight, the maiden flight on Gemini in March of '65. That was the first time an astronaut had actually flown a spacecraft, actually maneuvered it in space. The Russians hadn't achieved that ability yet. And after Gus's reputation was hurt, he actually caught a couple of breaks. John Glenn didn't fly again. And Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who would have been in line for the first Gemini flight, was grounded with Meniere's disease, inner ear problem. So Gus was in line, got the first maiden flight on Gemini. So he at this point, he's sort of making a comeback. And as I said, Gemini pretty much proved out everything we needed to do to get to the moon. Long duration flights, spacewalks, EVAs, rendezvous, and docking. You got to do all of these things before you can get to the moon. So Gus gets the first flight on Gemini. He backs a couple of flights, but now he's thinking he's gonna walk on the moon. So he transitions to Project Apollo. That's the three-man spacecraft that's going to take Americans to the moon. And the way it worked, this was a far more complex machine. And the plan was to do a Block 1 version and a Block 2 version. And it was Gus's job to work out the kinks on the first Apollo command module, the Block 1. And it was not his colleagues didn't miss the fact that Gus got the maiden flight of 2 space machines in the space of 2 years. Most test pilots would only get 1 in their entire career if they were lucky, and Gus got 2 in about the period of about 2 years. So at this point, he is ascending the pyramid of the right stuff. But as it turns out, he's really got a big problem on his hands. This is you get one command module behind them. Gus at one of his least favorite things, a press conference. But at this point, he had sort of learned to play the PR game. You can see his crew on the right, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, and then the rookie Roger Chaffee, another Purdue graduate, and then the backup crew, Jim McDivitt and Dave Scott. Dave Scott did walk on the moon. So during the press conference, Gus is sort of avoiding the reality that the spacecraft is really a mess. But a reporter asks him, "What would you consider a successful flight?" And he sort of sends a signal. He says, "If we all get back alive." So if you've got the right stuff, one definition of the right stuff is it's a unshakable belief in one's own abilities. So he kept pressing on. And this is a photo from late 1966. The environmental control system on the spacecraft leaks like a sieve. One of the oxygen tanks on the service module, which was like the trunk of the spacecraft, blew up during a vacuum chamber test. So they've got all kinds of problems with this spacecraft. And they sent this to the program manager, Joe Shea, saying, "We've decided to go above your head and ask for help." But this is sort of an example of Gus's sense of humor, I think this picture says a lot about the state of the American space program. They're in a big hurry at this point, and they've got a new contractor. They switched from McDonnell to North American Aviation, and they're trying to build this complex machine, and they're in a big hurry. So this is one of the last photos of Gus and his crew. It's again Ed White in the center and Roger Chaffee. They're going out to the pad on January 27th, 1967 for one of the final shakedown tests before they fly. It's called a plugs out test. And what they're going to do is the rocket's not fueled, but they're going to get in, they're going to pressurize the spacecraft, they're going to close the hatches, and they're going to do a simulated launch. And then at zero, the idea was they're going to switch to internal power. And the test was deemed as non-hazardous, primarily because, were not loaded with propellant. However, the design of the spacecraft, the Block 1 spacecraft on the launch pad used pure oxygen at 16 psi, slightly above atmospheric pressure, and designed to hold a cork-like inner hatch in so that there wouldn't be any pressure leaks. The spacecraft was filled with flammable materials and miles of machine bundled wiring, and I'll show you what some of this stuff looked like. But Mike Collins, who we mentioned earlier, concluded that this was the spacecraft was one big potential short circuit. And on January 27th, 1967, about 6:34 clicks after 6:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, one of the members of the crew reported a fire. Gus Grissom tried to dump the cabin pressure. He hit the cabin pressure dump valve so hard that he broke it. His next step was to help Ed White grab a torque wrench and try and undog this heavy hatch, inward opening hatch. And then there was an ablative hatch outside of that also had to be removed for them to get out. The temperatures in the spacecraft reached about 2,500 degrees. At those temperatures, in pure oxygen, a material like aluminum explodes, steel melts, and they basically never had a chance. I think it's possible that Ed White, who was an Olympic athlete, might have cracked the seal on the inner hatch, or scorch marks on the inside of this ablative hatch that also had to come out. But they really never had a chance. They were probably passed out in about 20 seconds. The crew was asphyxiated. They were not incinerated. They had bad burns that they probably could have survived. But after about 20 seconds, the pressure vessel, the inner part of the command module, burst. And there was a huge explosion on level 8 of the gantry on pad 34 at the Kennedy Center. And it took about 5 minutes for the North American workers to get through the smoke and open the hatches. And when they opened the hatches, it was dead. And the next slide is this. This is the aftermath of the engineering failure that was the early Apollo program. We were in a big hurry. There was poor engineering. There was poor quality control by NASA. They were in a big hurry to make this deadline, and they concluded later on that the program management suffered from what came to be known as go fever. And the historian Andrew Chaikin, who's written a lot about space, said that the fire's root cause was cognitive scientists called perceptual blindness, meaning that very smart people, sure that they were paying attention, missed what was right in front of them. And in this case, it was this huge mistake they made about pure oxygen on the launch pad. After this, in the Block 2 Apollo command module, they used a mixed oxygen, basically nitrogen oxygen here on the pad, and then they went to pure oxygen once they got to orbit at 5 psi. But they learned this lesson the hard way. Walt Williams, who was a legendary NASA engineer, observed later on that if the Block 1 Apollo spacecraft had been a horse, they would have shot it sometime in 1966, perhaps as early as 1967. So the odd thing about all of this tragedy was ironic. The great paradox was, if the fire hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have gotten to the moon by the end of the 60s. So what happened was that for 18 months, NASA didn't fly any spacecraft, but they put together a committee led by a legendary NASA engineer named George Lowe, and he put together it was called a configuration committee, and they made 1,300 different changes to the Apollo 1 spacecraft. They fixed it. It worked. It was one of the great machines ever built, and it flew 24 human beings to the moon in the late 60s and early 1970s. But this great paradox that without the fire, we probably don't fix this thing. That they realized that because the fire happened on the pad, they could trace the cause and fix it. If the fire had happened in space, they wouldn't have known for sure what had happened beyond the telemetry they had. So it's risk. Space is a risky. It's a deadly business. So this is just some examples of the terrible workmanship. These machine bundle wires that weren't protected. You might be able to see there's a socket wrench that was found left spacecraft. Again, the pure oxygen atmosphere on the pad was a huge mistake. We had done it 16 or 17 times and gotten away with it, but it finally caught up with the crew that night. And we learned the lesson the hard way. I got some other shot. This is the spacecraft being prepared to be shipped back to Langley after the investigation of the fire. And this is the 50th anniversary of the fire. I was invited down by Gus Grissom Lowell. You might notice that is Tom Stafford, who flew to the moon on Apollo 10. But there's now a permanent display to the crew, which is very significant because after 50 years, NASA finally acknowledged, what had happened and their mistakes, and this is all part of the process. This is the hatch that's now being displayed at the Cape Kennedy Visitors Center. And you can see how clumsy this thing was, how heavy it was. It was dogged down and had the idea is torque wrenches to get this thing pulled in, and then they had to set it aside and then take off another hatch. Next to it, you might be able to, this is the ablative hatch that covered it. For reentry, you needed something to protect the outer part of the spacecraft. So it was significant that NASA finally, after 50 years, decided they would display part of the spacecraft because we need to know about the sacrifices that were made. The narrative is that we did all these things and got to the moon. While there was a great deal of a risk, several astronauts besides the Apollo 1 crew were killed in various accidents, and it destroyed the families, the Grissoms, Whites, and Chaffees. These families suffered deeply after losing their husband and father. So that hatch was replaced with this. This hatch opens in 3 seconds. Very complex, but North American made it work. But you could get out of the spacecraft emergency in 3 seconds. So here's an example of something that good that came out of the fire. They fixed the spacecraft. So this is Langley Research Center, Langley, Virginia. This is where Gus Grissom's spacecraft finally ended up. I have filed a request with NASA to view the spacecraft, and so far they've ignored my requests. I have no desire to exploit this. I want to see the spacecraft for scholarly purposes to determine what happened. There is a book coming out on the fire, but the author doesn't have access to the primary sources, and the primary sources are the spacecraft itself, the autopsies on the astronauts that you could use to determine precisely what occurred from the first moment of the call of a fire. Here's another shot. I'm told that there's one person who knows the combination to that lock, but it's restricted. You can't get into it. I was told by Langley officials that their own materials engineers can't even get in to see it. So it's a pretty close hold. But maybe someday I'll be able to get in to see it, and maybe my next book will be on the lessons of Apollo 1. And we learned a lot. We learned a lot the hard way, but we made it to the moon. And the guys who went there never forgot the contributions of Gus Grissom. I believe I know there are craters named for the crew, and I believe there are a couple of stars that might be named for Gus Grissom as well. So again, my goal was to try to correct the record about the contributions of Gus Grissom, that he accepted risks. He knew that the longer he was on the flight line, the greater the chances that something could happen to him. But he soldiered on despite the fact that he had a death trap of a spacecraft, and he made enormous contributions to the exploration of our solar system, and that was my goal, to highlight those and to put his life and his career in the context of the history of human spaceflight. So one last slide. This is pad 34 where the accident occurred. This is for the night of January 20. Actually, it should be 27th. 2017, 50 years to the day of the fire. I was invited there for the ceremony. Each year, a group of people comes and commemorates the anniversary of the fire. It's a pretty stark place. There are lots of monuments, and it's unfortunately it's sort of rusting away, but quite a moving ceremony. So there's our main man. I thank you for listening. By the way, I want to especially thank my colleague Susan Rambo from EE Times, who first contacted me to ask me to speak before the society. So thanks for listening, and I hope that wasn't as dull as your razor.
Not dull at all. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
And yeah, Susan is watching right now too, and
Hi, Susan.
She asked a very interesting question. She was remembering that the Liberty Bell, or wanted to know whether it was true that the Liberty Bell was at Chabot here at our Science Center, and in fact, before the restoration, it was. And John Glenn came here to visit it because he had not been able to do so before then. And so it's a little piece of Chabot history as well.
I did not know that. I
neither
knew
did I, and I was around then, and somehow
Yeah.
I managed to miss that whole thing.
Yeah, I saw it when I was visiting my publisher in West Lafayette, and it was at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis, which is where I took those photos. And then I think it did a tour, and I didn't realize that it had gone out there. That's very interesting.
If anybody has any questions, if you're on Facebook, go ahead and put them in the chat for the live event. And if you are on Zoom, go ahead and enter them into either the chat or the QA. So far, other than the mention of that event where Liberty Bell was here at Chabot, we haven't had any. We have a few people who are, saying outstanding talk and all that, which is nice.
Yep. One thing, Richard, since you mentioned John Glenn, that I did also want to mention, there's a really fine biography, well, not a biography, it's sort of a history of the Cold War, centered on John Glenn, will be coming out next spring by Jeff Schessel. And Jeff has written 2 really good books, one on the battle in the 60s between Bobby Kennedy and LBJ.
Huh.
And he did a book about FDR trying to pack the Supreme Court in the 1930s, which is a relevant subject.
Sounds timely, yeah.
But he's written a book. I've read the manuscript on John Glenn as a Cold Warrior, and his insight on John Glenn, sort of the all-American guy, was that Glenn sort of projected this image, the way Americans wanted the rest of the world to view them, as if that he represented this ideal. So it's coming out in the spring. The book is called Mercury Rising: John Glenn, John F. Kennedy, and the Race for Space, and I highly recommend it. And by the way, I think you can see me. Here's Mike Collins' very good book that I lifted heavily from. This is probably the best book written by an astronaut. It's excellent.
There was one other question. Why do you think they're so secretive about access to the Apollo 1 capsule?
Well, my experience has been in filing Freedom of Information Act requests is that there's a privacy exemption under the FOIA. And that's what they cite as the reason that researchers can have access to the spacecraft, to the autopsy materials, the primary sources that you could use to piece together what may have happened.
Privacy for the families.
I think so. I think as long as the immediate families are alive, my attorney friends tell me is that they will probably not allow researchers access to it. I through some contacts at NASA, I got that close to the building at Langley. I was given the new employee tour down at Langley, and we got as close as the building, and I interviewed the fellow who's in charge of maintenance. They go in twice a year and check on the spacecraft or what's left of it. And he said, maybe we can get you in on one of those maintenance trips, but I haven't heard anything from NASA. So what their motivation is, I'm not sure. I mean, they say they want to protect the families. Betty Grissom died about a year and a half ago. Gus's two sons, are Scott and Mark, are still alive, about my age. So I don't know that they would have any objections. Perhaps Gus's brother Lowell says the spacecraft ought to be buried underneath Pad 34. Mm. So I don't know what the final disposition would be, but it's significant that NASA finally did display a part of the spacecraft. The story I tell is that Bob Cabana, who runs the Kennedy Space Center, actually negotiated with Betty Grissom to do this permanent display at the Kennedy Visitors Center. And the whole history of the Grissom family in NASA is very fraught. You know, Betty sued North American Aviation in the early 1970s. And once a test pilot's wife does something like that, she burns all of her bridges. You know, sure. The attitude was, you signed up for this, you know, are you trying to get money? You know, so it was very fraught. And my main source was Lowell Grissom, Gus's brother, who's done everything that he could to, you know, keep his brother's memory alive. He's worked on museum stuff, and we're in the process now of getting an Apollo 1 memorial established at Arlington National Cemetery. Believe it or not, there isn't one, and it was just approved by the full advisory committee. There's all kinds of bureaucracy. The full advisory committee at Arlington National Cemetery, and the Secretary of the Army has 90 days to sign off on it. Then Congress has to approve it, and then we'll start hitting guys like you up for money to pay for the memorial. And at some point, once the coast is clear and the pandemic, we'll dedicate this memorial to the crew at Arlington National Cemetery.
Question, how long have you been interested in Gus, and at what point did you feel like he wasn't being treated fairly? I mean, did it take, you know, the movie to do that, or was it before then, or you know, how did this evolve?
Yeah, so you know, as a kid, you're probably not old enough to remember, but you know, when we were kids, we would sit in front of the Zenith and watch this stuff live.
Oh yeah, I know, I remember
that. And you know, it was so compelling. You know, in the early days, these guys were celebrities. One reason they were celebrities, even though they had done nothing, was there was, you know, they figured these guys are going to get blown up on live television. I mean, they really are. They've got the right stuff. And you know, and then Apollo 11 and Apollo. I can remember my dad waking me up for Apollo 13 and saying, "Hey, they got a problem." And so I sort of got hooked on it. And I guess I've been writing about technology for 40 years and sort of in and out of it. And then there were one good thing that Tom Wolfe did was he renewed interest in what these guys had done. And this was by the late 70s. And then there were a string of documentaries that were made in the 80s and into the 90s. And I recall one of them, a very good one I recommend, called In the Shadow of the Moon. Mm-hmm. And in it, Mike Collins says, you know, we thought through everything, but we didn't really think through the consequences of using pure oxygen on the pad at 16 psi. And you know, Gus Grissom has got his hands full trying to save this, figure this thing out. And the last week before he died, when he was home, he grabbed a lemon off his tree from his house in Houston, put it in his duffel bag, took it back to the Cape, and he hung it on the simulator, which was a big mess because they couldn't keep up with the changes. And he told him, keep it there. So, you know, he's in doing things like that. He didn't endear himself to NASA management, no. But he was clearly signaling this thing is a mess. But, you know, I signed up for this, and I'm going to, you know, these guys figured they could fly the crate that the thing came in. And he knew that if he didn't take this flight, there were 10 guys lined up who would have jumped at the chance to take the flight. So, you know, he soldiered on. And this documentary I mentioned goes into this. And John Young, the only astronaut who ever flew in space with Gus Grissom on Gemini 3, John Young knew a lot about wiring, and there's a sequence in the documentary where he says, Gus, the wiring in this thing is terrible. Why don't you say something? And he said that Gus told him, if I say anything, they'll fire me. And I never got to interview John Young, who also died a couple of years ago. But what I think he meant was, if I complain, I'll lose my place in line. And I was sort of anticipating the question, would Gus have been the first man on the moon? We don't know that. It would have depended on the sequence of flights. He certainly would have commanded a lunar landing. He might have been the first. His boss, Deke Slayton, wanted him to be the first. But he just decided, I got to keep going here. If I survive this, then I'm going to walk on the moon. So that struck me as, wow, what's that all about? So I lived 20 miles from Arlington National Cemetery. I found Gus's grave. I looked at it and thought, wow, is this all this guy gets? All of the astronauts had written their memoirs, Shepard, Glenn, Apollo 13. And I thought, this guy deserves another look. So it took me 7 years. I found as many people as I could find. I gave Gus my best shot, and I really focused on this myth that Gus had hit the chicken switch, which it never happened. It was made up.
What did you think about the portrayal of Grissom and Apollo 1 in the movie First Man? Did you see that?
Yeah, I mean, they sort of always portray him as a gruff Gus. He's always, look out for Gus. He's planning his next flight. And I'm in touch with the guy, Michael Trotter, who's playing Gus in this Right Stuff reboot. Gus Grissom actually had a very good sense of humor. He had a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. He didn't say much. He wasn't a good bullshitter like John Glenn and Alan Shepard, but technically he was the best engineer of the early astronauts. So he tends to be sort of off to the side. He'd never, he could have cared less how much attention he would get. He just wanted to fly. Mike Collins, I met him when I was down at the Cape, and I rode in the bus with him out to the first dinner that I was invited to with Lowell Grissom. And he asked me, I have to give the keynote tomorrow. What should I say about Gus? Wow, Mike Collins is asking me. And I said, just tell him he earned everything he got. Nothing was handed to him. He worked his rear end off. And Mike Collins nailed it. He said that Gus Grissom was a great test pilot, but he had a love of machines, and he had to understand every aspect of them and how they worked. So that's what this guy's about.
Well, great. That's a good closing to this. I want to thank you again for speaking with us tonight. And I have a question for you. What size t-shirt do you wear?
Just to be safe, extra large.
All right. Well, go ahead and unshare your screen for a minute so I could show the membership what we've got going these days. There we go.
How's that?
So, whoop, hold on. I gotta change my video here so the virtual background doesn't absorb.
Yeah, right.
My video. Yeah, this is what the room I'm in really looks like. We have From Oakland to the Universe with
Beautiful.
Rocket and the Oakland Oak Tree. And this is the new Oaklandish, or the reboot of the Oaklandish Chabot t-shirt. And there's a link on our Facebook page for this. And if anybody in the audience is interested in that shirt, feel free to reach out and contact me. But you said extra large, right?
Extra large, thank you. Yeah, just to
right.
be safe.
Yeah. All right. Well, good night, everyone.
Hey, thanks. It was great. Thanks,
This,
everybody.
for those of you who joined us late, this will be available on our YouTube channel, and I'll send out an announcement when it's ready. All right. Take care now.
Thanks, you too. Good night.
Bye, George.